In a moment the world never thought would come, Francis Swaggart, the lifelong partner, co-minister, and confidant of one of America's most controversial yet beloved televangelists, Jimmy Swaggart, has finally broken her silence. After weeks of whispers, rumors, and unconfirmed reports, Francis stepped onto the Sun Life Broadcasting Network stage and, with trembling hands and a heavy heart, uttered the words no one was ready to hear. "He's gone home to be with the Lord." Those few words sent shockwaves across the world of faith and beyond. Jimmy Swaggart, a man whose voice once thundered across pulpits, airwaves, and millions of living rooms, was gone. But as Francis continued speaking, it became clear that this wasn't just an announcement of loss. It was a revelation, a glimpse behind decades of ministry, controversy, and redemption. And what she shared about his final days would leave millions speechless, because behind the headlines and the history was something no one expected: a story of love, forgiveness, and faith that endured to the very end. But how did it all unfold? And what truths did Francis finally reveal after a lifetime of silence? Long before the world knew his name, Jimmy Swaggart was just a young preacher from Faraday, Louisiana, a small-town boy with a piano, a Bible, and a dream so big it could barely fit inside the church walls that first held his voice. Born into a family where gospel ran deep, cousins with Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley, Jimmy's mix of music and message was destined to stir hearts. But even in those early days, no one could have imagined just how far that voice would travel. By the 1970s, Jimmy Swaggart had become more than a preacher. He was a phenomenon. His weekly telecasts reached millions across America, and soon the world. Through powerful sermons and gospel performances that blended soul, conviction, and raw emotion, Swaggart built one of the largest Christian ministries in modern history. His face was a fixture on television screens in over 100 countries. His voice echoed from revival tents to cathedrals. His piano hymns became staples of Sunday mornings, and his words, passionate, uncompromising, and deeply human, drew audiences hungry for hope. At his peak in the 1980s, it was estimated that over 500 million viewers tuned in to his broadcasts. To his followers, Jimmy wasn't just a preacher. He was a spiritual father, a guiding voice, a man who could stir conviction and comfort in the same breath. And yet, for all his success, those close to him knew there was something different about Jimmy. He carried the weight of his calling heavily, driven, disciplined, and determined to keep reaching one more soul. Every sermon, every song, every broadcast was another chance to save someone from the darkness. But in the midst of global fame and spiritual fire, another story was quietly unfolding, one that would test his faith, his reputation, and everything he had built. Because while millions saw the preacher on stage, few knew the man behind the pulpit, and soon the world would. For every rise, there's a fall. And for Jimmy Swaggart, that fall came hard fast, and under the blinding glare of the world's spotlight. In 1988, the man who had once been celebrated as the fiery voice of American revival found himself at the center of one of the biggest scandals in religious history. News broke that the famed televangelist, the same man who preached against sin, temptation, and moral compromise, had been caught in an act that shattered his image and shook the foundations of his empire. The revelation stunned his millions of followers. Congregations wept, critics pounced, and headlines screamed betrayal. But what happened next was something no one expected. Instead of hiding behind silence, Jimmy stood before his congregation and the watching world, trembling, tearful, and broken. In one of the most unforgettable moments in television history, he confessed his failures and cried out, "I have sinned." Those 3 words changed everything. His ministry collapsed almost overnight. Sponsors pulled out. Churches distanced themselves. Friends and colleagues disappeared. For many, the fall of Jimmy Swaggart was proof that even the most powerful voices could stumble. For others, it was a lesson in human frailty, a reminder that no one, not even a preacher, is above temptation. But through the public humiliation and the private heartbreak, one person never left his side: Francis Swaggart. While the world mocked and the media dissected every mistake, Francis stood quietly beside her husband. She didn't excuse his actions, but she didn't abandon him either. In later interviews, she would say those were the darkest nights of their lives. Nights filled with prayer, tears, and a desperate search for forgiveness. The ministry they had built together was gone. But something else was born in its place: humility. Over time, Jimmy and Francis began rebuilding brick by brick, service by service, until the flames of their ministry slowly reignited. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Out of scandal came repentance, out of shame came resolve, and though the world would never see Jimmy Swaggart the same way again, those who stayed saw something deeper: a man who refused to quit, a couple who refused to give up, and a faith that refused to die. But years later, as the lights dimmed and age crept in, that same determination would define Jimmy's final days, a private battle that no one knew about until Francis finally spoke. When Francis Swaggart finally spoke, the world learned that Jimmy's last years were not marked by fame or controversy, but by quiet faith, reflection, and preparation. Behind the camera lights of Sun Life Broadcasting Network, he had been fighting a private battle, one that only his closest family knew about. For more than 2 years, Jimmy had been battling a serious illness, one that gradually weakened his body but never his spirit. Francis revealed that he didn't want pity, publicity, or headlines. He just wanted to preach until his last breath, she said softly, her voice trembling. And that's exactly what he did. 10 days before his passing, Jimmy sat in his study, Bible open, piano nearby, and recorded what would become his final sermon. Francis hinted that the recording might soon be released posthumously, a final message from the man who had spent a lifetime calling souls to Christ. Those who have heard it describe it as raw, emotional, and unlike anything he had ever preached before, not fire and thunder, but peace and gratitude. In those last weeks, Francis said she saw a change in him, a gentleness, a reflective calm. He kept asking if he had done enough, she recalled through tears. He was worried about the souls he hadn't reached. But I told him, Jimmy, you did more than enough. As the days went on, his strength faded, but his faith grew stronger. He would spend his evenings reading scripture aloud, sometimes whispering prayers under his breath, other times singing the old gospel hymns that had carried him since childhood. Francis described his final morning as peaceful, sunlight coming through the curtains, his hand in hers. He smiled, she said. He told me, I see him, Francis. I see the Lord. And then he was gone. It was the kind of farewell only a man of deep conviction could have, not with fear, but with faith. The world didn't know it then, but while fans prayed for his recovery, Jimmy had already made peace with his journey. He had tied up loose ends, prayed over his family, and spent his final hours doing what he had always done, ministering, even in silence. And when Francis finally revealed those last details, her words didn't just break the news of his passing. They offered closure to millions who had followed his voice for decades. But even in death, Jimmy Swaggart's story wasn't finished. What Francis revealed next would shock even his most devoted followers, because behind the loss was something even more powerful: his final message to the world. It happened quietly, almost unexpectedly, not through a press release, not through a news network, but during a familiar morning broadcast on Francis and Friends. Dressed in black, her usually composed voice trembled as Francis Swaggart looked straight into the camera and said, "He's gone home to be with the Lord." For a moment, the studio fell silent. Then the world reacted. Within minutes, clips of her statement flooded YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. Hashtags like "You're not Jimmy Swaggart," "You were Francis Swaggart," and "Gone too soon" began trending across social media. Millions who had grown up watching his sermons or listening to his gospel records shared memories, tributes, and tears. Some remembered sitting beside their parents in front of the television as Jimmy's fiery preaching filled their living rooms. Others shared stories of personal transformation, moments when his sermons pulled them out of despair. And then there were those who, despite past controversies, simply wrote, "Thank you, Brother Swaggart." But Francis didn't stop at the announcement. For the first time in decades, she spoke freely, not as a co-host, not as a preacher's wife, but as a woman who had lived every victory, scandal, and heartbreak by her husband's side. She revealed how Jimmy had spent his final days filled with love, introspection, and faith, how he had prayed for forgiveness, for family, and for the world he had preached to for more than half a century. He was tired, she said softly, but his spirit was strong. When the moment came, he smiled. He told me, "I see him, Francis. I see the Lord." And then he was gone. The raw emotion in her words broke through the screen. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't polished. It was real, and that authenticity hit people deeply. News outlets picked up the clip within hours, calling it one of the most moving moments in modern Christian television. But Frances's message carried more than grief. It carried hope. In the midst of her heartbreak, she reminded viewers that faith wasn't about perfection, but perseverance. "We were broken people," she admitted, "but God used us, even in our flaws." Those words reignited something powerful among believers. Churches began organizing prayer vigils. Fans across continents held candlelight tributes. It was as if Frances had reopened a chapter of faith many thought was long closed. Yet her statement also raised new questions. Questions about the man behind the ministry, about what came next for the Swaggart family, and about the legacy Jimmy left behind. Because while Frances had broken her silence, she had also started a new conversation, one that stretched far beyond grief into legacy, redemption, and the future of everything they had built together. And that's when she made a promise that left viewers speechless. Jimmy's voice, she said, will not fade. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. What began as mourning turned into celebration, not of loss but of legacy. Sun Life Broadcasting Network didn't go silent. Instead, it filled its schedule with classic sermons, gospel performances, and archival footage that reminded the world why Jimmy Swaggart's voice had once shaken stadiums. Clips of him singing Jesus, just the mention of your name, resurfaced online, reaching millions who weren't even born during his ministry's peak. The song climbed trending charts across Christian streaming platforms, proving that his message still resonated. For many, it wasn't just nostalgia, it was renewal. Churches across America, from small-town congregations to massive urban ministries, began holding Swaggart tribute nights. Pastors spoke about the man who had preached redemption while wrestling with his own humanity. They remembered not the scandals, but the sincerity, the way he could make a sinner feel seen and a believer feel unstoppable. Meanwhile, the next generation of Swaggarts quietly stepped forward. Donnie Swaggart, Jimmy's son, took to the pulpit with a trembling voice but a familiar fire, declaring that the mission continues. His children, Gabriel and Matthew, took charge of broadcasting and music, pledging to carry their grandfather's torch into a digital era. Even Frances, though visibly heartbroken, returned to her show. She said she could feel Jimmy's presence every time the gospel music played, every time a caller phoned in to say, "He changed my life." There was a renewed sense of unity in the ministry, a feeling that something greater than loss was taking shape. Donations began to rise, viewership spiked, and Sun Life Broadcasting Network found itself reaching new audiences in countries it had never touched before. But as the Swaggart family moved forward, the internet began to stir with another question, one that wasn't about faith or legacy, but about truth. Because as tributes poured in, so did whispers. Stories, rumors, and unanswered questions that had followed Jimmy for decades began to resurface, not from enemies, but from within the very community that once stood by him. And what came next would test everything the Swaggart name stood for. Just as the dust began to settle, the internet did what it always does. It started digging. Old headlines, forgotten clips, and half-buried rumors about Jimmy Swaggart's past began circulating again, reigniting the very debates many thought had ended decades ago. It started on Reddit and X, where users revisited the scandals that nearly destroyed his ministry in the late 80s and early 90s. Was Jimmy ever truly forgiven? One post read, "Did the church turn a blind eye?" Another asked. Within hours, these threads gained millions of views. But what really captured attention were the new claims, the whispers that surfaced from those who said they had once worked close to the ministry. Some alleged that Jimmy had left behind private journals, filled with personal reflections never meant to be seen by the public. Others claimed that certain recordings, long locked away in Sun Life archives, contained messages he wanted shared only after his death. Of course, none of these reports have been verified. Frances and the ministry have not addressed them directly, maintaining a dignified silence. Still, the speculation has only grown, especially as online creators and bloggers dissect every word from Frances's emotional statement. Some say the timing of her message, her choice of words. Her pauses hinted that there was more to the story than the public knew. Others argue it was simply the grief of a woman who had spent her life standing beside a man loved by millions and criticized by just as many. But as one former Sun Life employee told Christian News Journal, Jimmy always said his story wasn't finished yet, even when the world thought it was. That single quote sent shockwaves through social media. What did he mean? Was he referring to his ministry or something more personal, something still unrevealed? While no solid evidence has emerged, the intrigue has reignited global curiosity about the Swaggart legacy. For younger audiences discovering him for the first time through viral clips, the controversies seem like ancient history. But for those who lived through them, they remain an uncomfortable reminder that greatness and brokenness often walk hand in hand. And now, as the Swaggart family stands at a crossroads, torn between honoring a powerful legacy and confronting its shadows, fans can't help but wonder, what will come next? Because even in death, Jimmy Swaggart's story refuses to fade quietly. In the weeks following his passing, a strange transformation began. For years, Jimmy Swaggart's name had carried both admiration and controversy. The preacher who rose to global fame fell in public disgrace and somehow found the strength to stand again. But now, with time softening the edges, his story was being retold, not as a scandal but as a testament. You could feel it in the tone of the media, in the comments under every tribute video. People weren't just talking about what he did wrong anymore. They were talking about what he did right. The songs, the crusades, the millions who found hope in his message of redemption. Even critics admitted he never truly gave up. Documentaries began to surface, revisiting his journey with a more balanced lens. Some called it the rise, fall, and faith of Jimmy Swaggart. Others said his life symbolized the modern struggle between temptation and grace. Either way, the narrative was shifting, and for Frances, that shift meant everything. She once said in an interview, "People will remember Jimmy for his failures, but I'll remember him for how he kept getting up." That line struck a chord. It wasn't just about Jimmy. It was about anyone who's ever stumbled but refused to stay down. The new generation of believers, many of whom never saw his original sermons, began rediscovering him on TikTok and YouTube. His passionate preaching style, his trembling voice, his unfiltered emotion, stood out in a world that often feels manufactured. Young viewers described it as raw faith, real conviction, and something missing in today's preaching. Meanwhile, Sun Life Broadcasting continued airing his old sermons daily, branding them as legacy messages. Each one felt like a window into another time, but the words still hit hard. "Sin will take you further than you want to go," he'd say, "but grace will bring you home." Even beyond the pulpit, his influence lingered in gospel music. Artists from Nashville to South Africa began covering his classics, and compilations of his songs hit digital charts once again. Through it all, the message was clear. Jimmy Swaggart's story had come full circle. He wasn't just a man defined by his flaws. He was proof that faith can rebuild what failure tries to destroy. And perhaps that's why so many people, even those who once turned away, found themselves watching him again. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human. In the end, Jimmy Swaggart's story isn't just about fame, failure, or faith. It's about the raw, unfiltered journey of a man who refused to stay silent. Even when the world turned its back, he preached to millions, fell before the same eyes that once adored him, and somehow found his way back to the pulpit, not with pride but with humility. Through every sermon, every song, every tear-soaked confession, he left behind something most people spend a lifetime searching for: truth. Not the kind written in headlines, but the kind that comes from the heart of a man who knew grace because he needed it most. Frances's final tribute summed it up best. "Jimmy wasn't perfect," she said softly, "but he was chosen." And that made all the difference. As those words echoed across the airwaves, the world remembered what had made him so powerful in the first place. Not his voice, not his fame, but his conviction. He was proof that even the most flawed among us can still be used for something divine. Today, his songs still play on gospel radio. His sermons still stream online. And in every corner of the world, someone still hears that trembling southern drawl declaring, "There's still room at the cross for you, For all the controversy, all the tears and all the speculation, one truth remains. Jimmy Swaggart's life was never about perfection. It was about perseverance, about falling, rising, and believing again. And maybe that's why decades from now, when people speak his name, they won't just remember the scandals or the success. They'll remember the message, that no matter how far you've fallen, grace always finds a way. Because in the story of Jimmy Swaggart, there was never just one ending. There was the man, the myth, and the message. And somehow that message still sings.